Welcome, everybody, to another Domo Lunch and Learn. I am obviously your host, Eddie Small, the Director of Community here at Domo, and I am excited because we have a new guest with us on the Lunch and Learns. There have been a lot of familiar faces cycling week to week, but today we get to introduce a brand new face, Jed Peterson. Jed, thank you so much for joining us. Jed is a Domo Technical Solutions Manager, and we're going to talk all about Microsoft Azure today, the portal app setup for all Domo connectors. Very excited about this. As we know, Microsoft is being used by a lot of our clients and customers here at Domo, and really looking forward to finding out what needs to happen to make sure that things are talking the way they need to be talking to bring that data and permissions inside of your organization. Jed, thank you again. I really do appreciate this. It's nice to have you on the live stream.
Yeah, happy to be here. Excited about it.
Yeah, this will be really exciting. So while Jed gets his screen set up, I do want to let you guys know if you have any questions during this session, anything specifically that pops up that you need to be like, oh, I need an answer to this, or Jed touched on something I wasn't really familiar with, more than happy to throw that into the conversation while Jed is going over his presentation. But with that, Jed, let's take it away. I'm going to turn it over to you. You're the expert here.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
While I'm getting my screen shared out, just set a couple of expectations with our meeting today. I'm not a Microsoft expert. I am a Domo expert. So there might be some questions outside of the basic setup that I might not be able to answer, but we'll give it a shot on the call. I've seen a lot of the different scenarios out there. On top of that, for the Microsoft Azure portal setup, typically one of the biggest requirements that you're going to have is to work with your Microsoft admin. They're going to need to approve the app, get it up and going and ready so that it can actually be used within Domo. So before you start the process, reach out to your IT team, track down whoever that person is to get them prepared for the entire setup. All right. What we're going to look at first today, before we even jump into the portal, is going to be a little bit of a PowerPoint deck that talks us through how the portal is set up, the permissionings, and kind of the general layout of it.
Okay.
And that should be popping up right now for us. Awesome. So in here, what we're looking at is kind of a general layout of how the Azure portal is going to work. On the left-hand side, you can see here we have the Domo connector. And what it does is it reaches out to the Azure portal. That portal will hold an application that you need to create. And within that application, it's got a couple of different ways to permission your content. And then the final step is where your content is stored within the tenants in Microsoft. We're going to take a look at this entire layout kind of in a reverse order. It makes a little bit more sense that way when you see the bottom pieces stacked together to access the actual app. The first one we're going to look at here is the tenant selection. And if you're not familiar with what a tenant is in Microsoft, this is an isolated container, right? This is some type of a grouping, an item, or a way of managing different groups within your organization. You can see right here, Microsoft suggests to use 1 million users, right? We're looking at 1 million users or more for these isolated containers. But most small organizations see those containers and say, you know what I could use this for? I could put this into my sales group. I could put this into my finance group. I can make a marketing group or an IT group. And I can really separate my organization out with these tenants. Because this is happening so frequently, Domo likes to suggest using multi-tenant unless you're really using these the way that Microsoft designed. In here, you can see that a single tenant will have access to the tenant, and within that tenant, you'll have users, contents, and different assets. But it doesn't have access to these other tenants or other groups that may have been created within the organization. When we do take a look at the multi-tenant option, you'll see that those branches are now open. You have that reach to those other departments or the other breakouts that you've made with these tenants within Microsoft. Once you have that tenant set up, we want to talk a little bit about the permissioning on there. There's really 2 different ways Microsoft will allow you to do this. One is designed for an application that you might create within your own organization, and the other method is more designed for what Domo's doing. I want to show you both of them so you know the bad method and then you know the good method. The first one in here is the bad method. I would highly suggest to never use this method. This can get you in a lot of trouble with your content. In here, this is what Microsoft calls an application permission. And essentially, all you need to do to get your data, content, assets, anything from your Microsoft organization is have the application created with the client ID and the secret value with the permissions at the application level. And really, what that means is that client ID and secret opens up the door to everything in that Azure portal. Any tenants that are associated with that application, it will have access to, and any of the content inside of those tenants, like your data, users, things like that, anybody would have access to with just that client ID and secret. So you can see how this is probably not the best way to go, really open and not very secure. So the way that Domo suggests to do this, we like to follow the Microsoft specific pattern, where you use a client ID and secret, then you delegate those permissions based on the user that's accessing the content. And what this does is you still give that user the client ID and secret, and they're able to get into the front door of your application here, right? They're in the application, but all your content, assets, users, and information is still locked up behind those tenants that we talked about. That's where that email address and password comes into play. What Domo likes to do on the back end is we identify the user who's trying to make the connection to SharePoint, and we get their email address, right? We send that off to SharePoint, and SharePoint says, okay, you need to now authorize with us as well. So you enter in your password on the SharePoint site through a little pop-up window, and that will authorize you and then delegate whatever permissions you personally have within SharePoint through the app, instead of giving you the full access that the application would give you. This sounds a little bit funny until you kind of see how it plays out with a couple of different users and groups. So we'll take a look at a couple of scenarios on how those permissions would play out. Originally, we had talked about the Azure admin here. Now, your admin, they're going to have full access to everything within the instance. You can see we've got them listed as blue here. Once they're in the door, they can access any of these other tenant doors and get into those groups. However, for the majority of your organization, you're going to have likely different groups or different tenants that will have access and content separated out from different groups. In here, you can see our sales manager is part of our sales tenant. And the sales manager can get in the front door to the application and then in the front door of our sales tenant here, but they won't have access to our finance team here or to a very unique view that their individual reps have below them. If we look at our finance manager, similar situation. They can get in that front door and they'll get access to their content, but nobody else. And then same with like the sales agent, a little bit different from the sales manager. They have a separate tenant just for them. And so in there, they're able to access their own information. The last piece that we're not seeing on this page here is if somebody has that client ID in secret, but has no access to a tenant. So they're not a part of your Microsoft organization. Somehow magically they've gotten that client ID in secret. They can still access that front door, but that's where it stops. They don't have access to any of the tenants. They don't have access to any of your content within those tenants. And so they're really just at a dead end. And this is why we really suggest you use that delegated permission to give that multiple layers of security. On the opposite side of that coin, though, we do have to think a little bit about strategy with who is adding their accounts within the Domo environment. We talked about these different users. If they were to create it, they'd have access to their own content. And one of the things that you may or may not want to do is have your admin create the account within Domo. The admin will have access to every tenant. So depending on how you structure your organization, if you want all of your admins to have access to everything in SharePoint, you'd have the admin or an admin type account create that account within Domo. That way it'll have access to everything. Otherwise, you might just want to rely on the individual users so that they have that delegated permissioning. All right. So let's take a look at how this kind of plays out within the Microsoft portal. So we will need to go to the portal first. Oops, that's going to be portal.azure.com. For me, when this loads up, I frequent this one area. And so up at the top, Microsoft gives you this little favorites area. If it's your first time visiting this site, you likely won't have that there. Look right below in this services area here. It might pop up at the beginning, but if you don't see it in this list, hit the more services here. And then it should be either up here on the top, or you can just even just search for the Azure Active Directory. Depending on the application and what it's doing within Microsoft, will depend on the application type. Today, we're going to focus on connectors, and the connectors really work with the app registration. If you're thinking of something like SSO or single sign-on, you'll likely be looking at the enterprise application. Best way to tell, if you pull up the Domo guide, it'll tell you which type of application through the steps that you need to create. All right, in here you can see we've got a couple of applications. I'm going to make that just a teeny bit bigger. There we go. We've got one SharePoint created and then our OneDrive created, which are two of the most common. We're going to recreate our SharePoint application. The reason I have these names in here is that in the past, Microsoft did have a rule where this naming convention for these apps were specific to the name and not an underlying GUID or identifying number. So when you're creating this app, if you get some type of an error message about the naming convention, try and make it a little bit more unique. There might be a naming conflict. For the most part, that problem has been solved, but it does pop up once in a while. All right. In here, this is the hardest part probably of the entire application, one of the two hardest pieces. The reason why is because some of these steps, if we skip them at the beginning, you have to start over. You can't go back in and re-add these settings to the application. So be really cautious on this first step. I like to give it a name to help me remember what this application is for. And we'll just put SharePoint connection to Domo in here. The next step in here was that big piece we talked a lot about, that tenancy. We really suggest you do that multi-tenant. That's typically going to give you the best reach to all your tenants and give you the most access. But work with your IT team, discuss that security policy and the limits that we talked about and see what one's going to work best. It still can work with single tenant, but again, your scope and your reach is a little bit limited to what's within that tenant. The next part is our redirect URI. And this is a piece that if you miss this on the first step, you likely won't be able to re-add it and you'll just have to start over. This is a web setup. And then we're going to need the redirect URI. So let me show you where that's at. If we go to our knowledge base, perfect. We can then search for our SharePoint. And this is our REST connector. You'll see that this is the preferred, but SharePoint REST are the keywords that'll get you to find the connector in here. It's this first one, the Microsoft SharePoint Online REST connector. And down in here, you can see in the prerequisites, right, we have to set up the app, you've got to register it, and we need that redirect URL right here. So we are going to copy this and add this to our application. Let's make sure I got that right. Let me try that again. May have to text or paste this into because it's a hyperlink. So we'll try it one more time, see if it'll do it properly. There we go, got it. All right, so The first thing that you're going to need, we've created the application. There are additional steps we have to do, but the first thing I want you to pay attention here is this application client ID. You can copy it just by hitting this little double paper icon here. This is the first part of the sign in on the Domo connector side. The next step that we want to take a look at is our API permissions in here. And I like to go to our guide again. This is kind of listed in two spots. If we scroll down a little bit, it'll show you the permissions that it's adding here. But personally, I like this screenshot the best. This calls out a lot of really important information. One, it's got the type of Microsoft Graph permissions that we need. You'll see that we're showing the delegated type that Domo prefers. And then the last piece over here is that they are all granted. So to do that, we'll come in here and click Add Permission. We'll go to our Microsoft Graph, select our delegated permission, and then I just like to swap back and forth and look between them. I know a lot of these permissions already, so we'll just click quite a few of them. Some of these permissions are going to start with things like group or file reports. And really what you want to do is just scroll down till you find your group file report. Where's our groups? Open it up and then add the permissions as needed. So this is a group read all. We would select this one. You can do multiple permissions at once. You don't have to add one at a time and come back. You could then come back in here to like the file if we wanted to. Oops, it's going to be up here, files. And select our permissions here, which is read all, read write all. And then once you have your full permission set listed, you're going to add them. This is a condensed list. Please be sure to reference the guide here to make sure you have the full permission list. If you do leave any of these permissions out, there's a good chance that the app on the Domo side may fail. All right, so once we've got our permissions in place, you'll notice that this grant for Domo hasn't happened. And then you'll also notice right up here, this grant admin consent for Domo is grayed out. This is a really big indicator that I am a user of the Azure portal, but I'm not the admin. What we need to do now is contact our admin and let them know, this app has been created. Will you please come in here and grant consent? Otherwise, this app will just block all access to these permissions that we've added until they've been granted that permissioning. Once it is granted, you're going to get a green check mark just like we have on that screenshot there. And that's perfect, just exactly how you want it. All right, last piece on here is going to be your certificates and secrets. In here, you'll do a new client secret. Up here, you'll want to give it some type of a name. And then you need an expiration. This is a pretty big call out, and it's normally a conversation again with your IT team. Your IT team will typically have a limit on how far out these credentials will be good for. I suggest personally pushing it out as far as you're allowed to push that out. And here's the reason why. Not if, but when these credentials expire, all of these credentials are powering data sets within your Domo system. So when they expire, those data sets stop working in Domo. So push that out as far as you can. Make sure you set a reminder when to go in here and update it, and then also update your Domo connectors at the same time. We'll take the furthest option that we can for this example and hit add. And in here, this is another update that Microsoft has done in the last year or two. This is a little bit different from your standard API, client ID, and secret naming convention. Normally, you would see the client or the secret ID here and say, this is our the password part. That's our secret value. But Microsoft does it a little bit different. This is actually an identifier for your secret value here. So the one item that you actually need here is in the value. And this is just your identifier. These are like passwords, right? So keep them safe, keep them protected, just like you would a password. And anytime that you do navigate away from the page or refresh the page, and then go back to that client secret and ID section, that value is going to be obfuscated out. So you won't be able to see it again. You won't be able to copy it, so you get it once. So highly suggest once you create it, copy it, keep it safe. If you ever need to, you can come in here and delete it, and that automatically stops all access from Domo being able to use use this app. All right, let me see if I'm missing any parts on here. I think that's the main pieces in there. Let's take a look. Yep, I think that's all on the Azure portal. Let's take a look at the Domo side once you have this part set up. So in our data center, we'll go over to our connectors. Just type our SharePoint, and you'll see our preferred SharePoint connector is the REST connector. In here, you're going to see that client ID. So from the Azure portal, you'll go to your overview and take that application client ID and paste that into your client ID. If we had copied that value, we would place the value in here and hit connect. Let me close out that little window. And hopefully we're seeing this. Perfect, yep. Need admin approval. So this is that little SSO pop-up window for that delegated permissioning. Me as a user is now going to be authenticated through Microsoft with my personal email address and then have those permissions delegated to me. Because the app wasn't fully set up and created, you can see that we need admin approval, that same message that we were talking about before. However, if this was set up correctly, this would just have you enter your credentials, it would flash away and take you to the report section of the connector, which is what we're going to take a look at next. In our guide, you'll see a lot of different reports in here. Pretty big list, and it can be a little bit overwhelming trying to figure out how do I get my data. There's typically two methods that I suggest doing with this data. One method is if your SharePoint site is small, I suggest going directly to your, I think it's the reports. Oh, it's files, there it is, sorry, past it, files. Go directly to the files report. The reason why is that Microsoft on the back end, they claim that there's not a timeout for SharePoint, but the Graph API that we're using to access SharePoint does have a timeout. And so if it runs too long to searching through a very, very large SharePoint site, it can fail. On the other side, if it's a smaller site, you're just going to get the data back. So I always suggest testing out with just a file first. If it does fail, Domo's done something to help you out there as well. We have a ton of other reports that are metadata about the sites. My favorite one here is the all sites. There's a couple other in here for things like group sites for metadata. You know, you can list root sites, things like that. And a lot of these reports are just going to give you information about what you have within SharePoint. The biggest key piece is an identifier for your asset or content. If you have an Excel file, you'll be able to get the ID for that Excel file. That's a pretty difficult item to get on the SharePoint site. And so what I like to do on those bigger groups is set up a couple of these reports in Domo, get all the IDs that I need for the reports, and then set up the SharePoint connector for specific reports. And the reason why we do it this way is because when we do a general search through the API, that's when we're going to hit that timeout on those bigger sites, is that we're searching through everything you have and eventually not getting to it before we get stopped. And so if we know exactly what we're looking for, then we can just enter that site ID and we're not doing that big search time frame, and it'll immediately pull back, really preventing that timeout of the SharePoint site. All right. So those are most of the tips and tricks. Let me stop the screen share for setting that up on the Microsoft SharePoint. But I did want to leave a couple of minutes for questions.
Yeah, that's great, Jed. Thank you for that. This is obviously lots of folks out there using Microsoft and lots of folks out there that probably have questions about how to properly set them up. And if there are any specific questions, anything that's jumped out to you, I was kind of checking some of the other platforms that we have where we're streaming this live, just to make sure we're not missing anything anywhere else. But feel free to put those in the chat in the next few seconds, and we'll be happy to answer them while you're gathering a question. Or if you feel like Jed did a good job, make sure to show him love in the chat. We have our April community virtual monthly meetup that's happening on Thursday at 10:30 Mountain Time. Really excited about this because we have hundreds of people registered, and the data science team is going to be taking over our community virtual meetup. So we'll do a little hosting, but let them kind of run the show. Just really excited for them to come in as a team. They're going to bring a customer with them to do a little use case. If you have not registered yet, I am throwing right now in the chat the link to register for that event. So if you haven't registered, make sure you hit up that chat link, and you'll be able to be provided there. Jed, no questions coming in as always. Appreciate it, my friend. Thank you so much. Hope to see you on another live stream. This can't be your last. It can't be
right. We got to do it again.
Well, I appreciate that. For everyone else, we'll see you on Thursday at our community virtual meetup, and then we'll be back with more Lunch and Learns the following week. Thanks again, everybody, for joining.
Thanks.